Good morning. I'm Michael Daniel, President and CEO of the Cyber Threat Alliance. I'm very pleased to have Mieke Eoyang with me this morning for our conversation. I will let her introduce herself and give her official title over at Third Way.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mieke Eoyang. I'm the Senior Vice President for the National Security Program at Third Way.
Great. Well, thanks for joining me this morning for a conversation. We've got a plethora of topics. It's not like we ever have, a paucity of topics in cybersecurity, but we seem to have a bunch right now to talk about.
There's a lot of news.
Yeah. So I thought maybe just to get started, nation state activity usually gets most of the media attention. In fact, we can see that, from the sunburst, solar winds coverage right now, which is certainly important. But for most organizations, cybercrime is actually a much more pressing problem in general. So can you talk a little bit about why cybercrime is such a problem, and why should the U.S. government and other governments make fighting cybercrime a higher priority?
Yeah, we get a lot of attention on the nation state attacks, and certainly it's a big deal whenever they hit government systems. But what we saw in the FireEye attack and in a whole range of other things is that it's actually a huge number of private sector victims as well. What we've seen over the course of the pandemic is a tremendous increase in the number of cyber attacks on private sector victims, and these are often cyber crimes, ransomware attacks, the kinds of things that disrupt hospitals and school systems, disrupt small businesses and could even put them out of business. At Third Way, we've done some polling work on this, and so have some others, and we found that as many as 1 in 4 Americans are victims of cybercrime, some kind of financial implication to a cyber intrusion, not just a regular crime that has a cyber component. And that's actually a big deal because it makes it the most prevalent form of crime in America. And the impacts of that, the cost to defend, the cost of going down, the potential second-tier liabilities that come from disclosing, the loss of consumer confidence, it's all a huge impact. But what we've started to see with these ransomware attacks on state and local governments, on school systems, on hospital systems, is a real impact on people's lives. And in some cases, in ways that may really cause harm to people who can't get urgent medical treatment or cancer treatments or things like that. It's becoming a real impact to Americans, to everyday Americans, not just the Defense Department or our intelligence agencies.
Yeah, and I think the truth is, right, for the vast majority of Americans, and frankly, most people around the world, you're much more likely to run into a cyber criminal in cyberspace than you are, the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, and the North Koreans, of course, are always questionable since they act like cyber criminals a lot of the time. But, you're much more likely to encounter cybercrime than, nation state activity. I mean, yes, if you're a journalist or you run an NGO that operates in those regions, you've got a different threat profile. But for your average business, cybercrime is a much bigger problem.
Yeah, and it's not like this is an either-or threat. It's not like there are just cyber criminals and nation-state criminals. One of the things that we've seen, and you mentioned North Korea on this, is there are a number of nation-states that are trying to bring in revenue through cybercrime. The North Koreans trying to steal or engage in ransomware because they're so heavily sanctioned, they need the money coming in. Or countries like Russia, where it's this sort of blended threat where we've seen nation state hackers operate on the state by day and then steal things at night. They are financing the development of their offensive cyber tools in many cases by recruiting criminals and allowing nation state actors to make some money on the side. So it's not like this is just one or the other, and that as a country, as a national security establishment, we should be ignoring the cyber criminals. These things are much more connected than I think we have recognized in the past.
Yeah, and I think actually, you mentioned ransomware, and I think that's a good example of where what has been perceived, I think, until recently as primarily kind of a criminal nuisance or kind of an economic nuisance has now moved into a threat to national security, a threat to public health and safety. ransomware is really hammering a lot of sectors right now. But I mean, how do you see that threat evolving?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen a tremendous increase in reported ransomware since the spring. And as people have moved to a work from home environment, the network defenses get more complicated. We've seen the attackers shift their tools to be able to take advantage of people who are operating at-home commercial networks, which may or may not have the kind of security that they need. We just have been a little bit more lax about protecting ourselves at home, but now home is the office and we're accessing sensitive systems from here, proprietary information, things like that we need to do our work. So ransomware has become a more valuable target for people who are trying to hit people where it hurts. But also we've just seen the success of ransomware because people pay. It's profitable. And so we've seen a real increase in cybercrime. And I think that, we've done a lot of work on this, but law enforcement needs to do a lot more to be able to catch up with the criminals who are operating at scale.
Yeah, and I think, one of the things that really has struck me is this is one of the places in cybersecurity where there is the potential for a real divergence between what's in the public interest, right, which is not paying ransoms and not enabling those cyber criminals to continue to gain money from this, and what's in a private entity's interest, because in many cases it is directly in that private entity's interest to pay the ransom, to just pay it and move on, right? And that it's a cost-effective answer from their perspective, and that divergence between the public and the private interest is actually a place that the government needs to figure out how to bridge that gap.
Yeah, and we've seen that challenge even, in the lack of coordination in the Trump administration. As you and I have talked about many times, they've eliminated your old office. They have taken people out who are really good at this, right? The Homeland Security Advisor, Tom Bossert, who's got a great op-ed today, Chris Krebs at CISA, there are not people who are really focused on this. But I think that this is a real challenge in the government coordination. And we've seen, conflicting guidance come out of the government. On the one hand, right, we've talked about this before, the guidance from OFAC saying, hey, if you pay this ransom, you might be guilty of a sanctions violation. At the same time, law enforcement is saying, hey, we just want you to report to us. And yes, there may be secondary criminality here, but the important thing is that we know, and we're not going to blame you as the victim. We're going to treat you as the victim, and we're going to investigate this and try and get the bad guy. There are tensions there because there may be actually criminal activity that occurs in the disclosure and reporting of a breach, right? These reports that solar wind investors may have traded stock before the breach went public, insider trading we saw in Equifax is a problem. That's not to say that people should get away with things, but we've got to coordinate what these interests are. And it's a particular challenge, because we've got this huge cyber insurance market. And from an insurer's perspective, if you're being told, hey, pay a $60,000 ransom or pay $2 million to burn your system to the ground and reboot it from scratch, which one from a business perspective are you supposed to do? It seems like it might be the right thing from a moral perspective to not pay, to not encourage. But the cost to the individual on that decision is very different. Yeah.
And I think that just really points to how difficult it is for governments to sort of, thread some of the policy challenges in this area. Third Way has recently put out a report, though, on some of this, on this very topic, and what should governments be doing, particularly the U.S. government, to better tackle the cybercrime problem.
Yeah, look, one of the challenges that we've seen in cybercrime and dealing with this is everyday businesses are dealing with the criminal part of it, the intrusions that drive business email compromise, attempts to defraud, things like that. But largely, unless it's a really big case, law enforcement hasn't been able to prosecute many of those things. We did research and found that of the 350 or 300,000 odd cases reported to the FBI, only 6 saw an arrest, making it an enforcement rate of 3 in 1,000. That's really unacceptable given the prevalence and the magnitude of what's going on. Any individual incident may seem below threshold for the FBI to investigate, but the crime scales. And so we know that single perpetrators can conduct, dozens, hundreds, thousands of events, and that would make it worthwhile to investigate. The government's really got to do a wholesale rethinking on cybercrime to figure out what it can and should be doing to get at the human behind the attack. Because for a long time, we've thought about this as defending our way out of the problem. But as long as the attacker is free and at liberty to continue to develop new tools and come back at you, they just keep getting better and better. And unless you can impose consequences on the human to hold them accountable for breaking the law, you can't get to the root cause. And so we need to really think about this as the full scope of things. Yes, you have to defend your networks, but also that human cyber criminal should not be feeling a sense of impunity. They should be looking over their shoulder, wondering, is that knock on the door the pizza guy, or is that knock on the door Interpol? And we need to do more of that.
Yeah, and I think the challenge, of course, is that many of these cyber criminals live in countries where the government is either incapable of helping or doesn't want to help for a variety of reasons, right? And so I think that in addition, as we build out that, regardless, right, this argues for a very strong international aspect to what we're doing, right? And really involving other countries and helping us tackle the cybercrime problem, because while there are cyber criminals who live in the United States, a lot of them do not. And I think we really have to be thinking about, the full scope of ways that we can impose consequences on the cyber criminals, including, technical disruptions to their infrastructure, looking at how the black markets operate, looking at how the financial system for moving the money around operates, where are the pressure points that we can find to put pressure on those criminal groups while we are working up and building the capability to actually physically get to them. So I think that's really very much a long-term problem that we're going to have to work, towards fixing. But there are steps we can do in the interim to try to impose some consequences on the bad guys.
Yeah, and I think we need a collective better understanding of who, where, how many bad guys we're talking about. Where are they located? I think there's a perception that all the bad guys are in Russia and Russia's never going to give them up. But we know that they travel, and we know that there are a lot of these facilitators who are in other countries. I mean, we all, the Nigerian prince scam is like a joke at this point, but Nigeria is a big center of business email compromise. Are there countries where we can actually work with those governments to develop law enforcement, to encourage them to shut down some of these safe havens for criminals? And also, right, there's the money aspect of it, which you mentioned, right? We know the Secret Service, for example, has been very aggressive on the money laundering part of this. And how do you track the funds, right? There's a Bitcoin ledger. How do you figure out where the money is where the ransom is being turned into money? Where is the fraud going? Who's facilitating those payments? And can we disrupt the financial chain? We've done that on terrorism. We should be thinking about doing that more aggressively here.
Yeah, I think that's where, right? I mean, these criminals, in many cases, they're in it for the money. And so if you can disrupt the financial chain, that really hits them where it hurts. And so I think that definitely has to be an aspect of what we're trying to go after as we're looking at, how we go after cybercrime more broadly. Mm-hmm. I think, Mieke, with a new administration coming in, we've, got an opportunity to reset some of these priorities and refocus activities. And some of the third way report is also about, priorities for the new new administration. And you know, as you might imagine, I've got a few opinions on this topic. But what, you know, from your point of view, what should the Biden administration be doing to prioritize cybersecurity?
Yeah, I think one of the things they've got to do is they've got to announce some big cybersecurity appointments that bring confidence to industry and people that there are going to be more people in these jobs that the Trump administration has eliminated, because it's important to have people who can coordinate across government and get things done and sort of wrestle with the interagency. That's, you know, we talk about the importance of the White House cyber coordinator, national cyber director in the report. That's a key component of it, because you need a coach/quarterback, right, getting everyone on the same page on this. But we also think that, like, going after ransomware and making it a priority, cybercrime and ransomware, is really important for this administration. The incoming National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, has talked about how do we do national security for the middle class. Well, these cyber criminals have fallen sort of below the priority line for really disruption and intelligence collection, because we've been focused on the nation state actors. But it's the criminals who are doing the things that really harm everyday Americans, who make people nervous about online banking, who are taking tolls on and shutting down businesses across America. Those are real impacts to people's lives. And the national security community has a lot of capability to be able to identify and help disrupt and help hold accountable these criminals. We have to make sure that we're not ignoring that threat just because it's not wearing a Russian or Chinese military uniform.
Yeah, and I think that when you look at, like, what's needed, right, the definitely recreating, rebuilding some of that interagency structure, you know, putting in place a national cyber director. You know, I've had an op-ed on, you know, creating that kind of position, you know, strongly supporting it. I mean, it doesn't, you know, I should be clear, having held one of those kind of coordination jobs, having a position like that does not magically eliminate all of the cyber threats or make the U.S. government perfect in, you know, preventing breaches like, you know, the SolarWinds breach. But it does make the government's response to them more, you know, it can make the government's response to those breaches more effective, right? And it can reduce the probability of having those because you get better cybersecurity policies. You can never drive that risk to zero. And when you're talking about, you know, a nation state conducting espionage, right? That's, I mean, as particularly a nation state as capable as China or Russia, like, you're never going to prevent all of that 100% of the time. But you can reduce the likelihood of it occurring, and you can reduce the impact of it occurring when it does.
Yeah, and I think that there are real questions about what the government knew and when they knew it about this, right? FireEye made public its breach, and it gave some indicators that allowed people to be able to look for this on their own networks. But what we're seeing now in the press is there were other security researchers who are raising concerns about the SolarWinds security practices. And these are the kinds of things that maybe a technical person understands, but it takes being able to raise it to a political level and having those people coordinate about what to do to be able to really break through with this. Otherwise, it sort of stays at that worker bee level and no action is taken. Because as we've seen, and Tom Bothert lays this out really well in his op-ed, the cost of this, of remediation of this, is going to be substantial, and it's going to take political will to say, okay, we are willing to pay this bill to be able to ensure that we don't have the Russians in our network anymore. And that's a hard thing for somebody who's like a, technical analyst down in the bowels of some agency to be able to flag for people. And if they don't have the top cover from people in the administration to do that, right, it's a challenge. And so even to this day, we have not seen the Trump administration acknowledge how big a deal this breach is and what it could mean for our national security. You need those senior people in place at the White House and other places to say, hey, America, this is for real and this is serious, and there's a bill coming to fix this. And we haven't seen that yet.
Yeah. And actually, that's a good segue to another question that I wanted to talk to you about, or to ask you and talk to you about, but given your background in spending time in Congress, because when it comes to the money, right? Ultimately, it's going to be Congress that's going to have to appropriate the money that's going to be needed to fix this problem. And, you know, a lot of people don't think of Congress as having much in the way of cyber expertise. But the truth is that several members, you know, people like Representative Jim Langevin or Senator Mark Warner and many staff up there, like yourself, you know, actually have pretty significant cyber expertise in cybersecurity now. But what does Congress need to do to improve its ability to make good law relating to cybersecurity?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the big things that Congress needs to understand is where it needs to make law and where it needs to leave things to the industry or the agencies to figure out. Because one of the things that is true in cyber and technology generally is it's moving fast. And so certain things that if you were to enshrine them in law at a certain standard would be outdated before the ink was dry. And so like they have to make some clear decisions and wrestle with some things that are tougher. And I think that there are times when those policy decisions have not been teed up well for them, what the trade-offs are, right? You see this in the debate over encryption or 230. It's like, yes, you have this thing you want to fix. There is a problem, but the solution that you're recommending has all of these collateral consequences. And I think that there's a real lack of sort of objective analytic thinking about some of those things that Congress can go to. Many of us, and we feel like a broken record on this, have said that Congress really needs to restore the Office of Technology Assessment to help give them the kind of advice that GAO does, but specific to some of these technology trade-offs. And, you know, we did away with that in the mid-90s at a time when technology was just starting to explode. But there are places where trade-offs are big, right? We see this all the time. Security versus flexibility, right? Regulation and innovation. There are things that we need to think about, you know, sharing versus keeping close. All of these things Congress has to wrestle with. And I think those are tough decisions, but we're going to have to make some choices as a nation, how we balance those factors. And Congress needs more help, I think, having it teed up for them. And they also need it sort of told to them in non-technical language. And right. I'll just mention this here. Look out in the beginning of January for a podcast that we're producing to try and illustrate some of these challenges on cybercrime in a narrative fashion so that people can sort of understand as we walk through it what the challenges are here.
Yeah, and I think that's, you know, I think it's really important for Congress to be able to get that kind of technical advice, right, in a way that is couched in policy terms. In fact, I felt like a large chunk of my job as the cybersecurity coordinator was actually doing that translation function, right, of, okay, why policymakers do you need to care about this thing over here, right, because it's actually important, and here's why. And this is why you can ignore this thing over here that, yes, it's getting a lot of media attention, but is in fact actually mostly just, you know, fluff and hyperbole. And I think being able to sort through those technical challenges, you know, and that's actually true in a lot of different areas, you know, across government. And I think definitely being able to bring that, you know, that technical expertise to bear as well. So you're making both legally smart, policy smart, but also technically smart policies and laws is really important.
Yeah, and look, this is the challenge, I think, of the politicals in jobs like yours, right? Yes, it's important to have technical people, but if the technical people cannot engage the non-technical policymakers to tee up the challenges and the solutions to help give them an accurate understanding of what's going on, I mean, as a former staffer, I've watched them sort of tune out and glaze over. And if they don't have a correct understanding of the way the technology works and what the challenges are, what the vulnerabilities are, then they're going to make laws in ways that are not accurate to the situation on the ground or unworkable. And so that's a real challenge, I think, for technologists, is how do you make it understandable to a non-technical expert, not just for the elected officials, but for the American people, so that they understand the impact on their lives. And that's a hard job. It's not just good at, you know, coding. There's something, right. There's another piece of this that you have to be able to do.
Yeah, and I think that's, you know, that's a that's a challenge. That's a continued challenge for both the tech industry and the cybersecurity industry. In particular, I think as we just have a couple of minutes left in our chat here, I definitely want to delve a little bit more into the solar wind sunburst. We're going to have to come up with what name we want to call this long-running campaign. But I think it's really important to think through what this event is, what it's not. I mean, it's certainly extremely significant. It's going to ruin a lot of people's holidays. But at least in my mind, so far, it actually doesn't warrant the moniker attack. I will say, as an aside, it actually warrants the moniker. It actually warrants the descriptor sophisticated, which a lot of intrusions don't. Like everybody's intrusion is sophisticated, but this one actually is, right? But I actually think that so far the evidence that we have is that it is espionage, which makes it not actually an attack. Now, because it's not destructive or disruptive. Now, that doesn't mean we don't treat it very seriously. And as you were talking about, the cost of fixing this problem could be ginormous. That's a technical budget term. From
the OMB guy.
Yeah, from the OMB guy, that ginormous. Real money. But so how do we think about this, enormous cyber espionage activity in a geopolitical context? And, how should we be thinking about it?
Yeah, I mean, this is a challenge, right? Like the terminology here matters. And we've seen a lot of people use the term, cyber attack and cyber weapon and talk about this in war terms. And I think that that's actually wrong, because when you think about it in war terms, you're thinking about like, well, okay, if I think that this is an attack and an act of war, then am I willing to escalate this through a kinetic, strike where I'm going to send missiles or fighter planes or American soldiers to go, blow up something in response? And right. I don't think that that's the right answer, right? Espionage is something that occurs all the time. It's tremendously serious. But there's a big difference between, as you said, an attack that causes an effect and an intrusion that's designed to gather information, right? The people who are the victims of intrusions that gather information, their systems are still running. It's just that their information is now compromised. That's a different kind of crime. But one of the things that we know is that the Russians are trying to expand the gray space. They're trying to expand their freedom of movement where they know we're not going to respond. And if our trigger for response is this an act of war or not an act of war, so we can go kinetic, so we can blow some stuff up, then that's a really big freedom of activity and a range of activity for the Russians. But if we say, look, some of these things are unacceptable, and we are going to say that violations of the CFAA, getting onto people's systems in an unauthorized manner, are criminal activities, that's another way to say that this is not acceptable. And it allows you, once you've started that criminal process, to seize funds, assets, accounts, do other things that are disruptive, prevent freedom of movement, issue notices for arrest. There's lots of stuff that we can do to the human that is short of, as they say on the military side of things, warheads on foreheads. And we need to think more broadly about the full range of things that we can do so that we don't allow that freedom of activity short of military activity.
Yeah, and I think that, certainly one of the things that we've seen in the past, right, is that, there were steps when, espionage or other activities, felt like they crossed a line or got too big or whatever, that you would, effectively send home some of the diplomats and other spies, right? The terminology is P&G them, right? Persona non grata. And that was a signal, right? That, hey, this activity had gotten out of hand, even if it was an accepted activity like espionage, like, hey, this one got a little too big, you got, too far, we're going to send you a signal, right? And so I agree that just because, but I do think it's important to not overuse those terms attack and war and things like that, and reserve them for when the activity actually warrants that.
Right.
So that we don't confuse it.
I agree. And like when we have an incident like this, that is very different, I think, than a ransomware attack that has the effect of denying people access to an emergency room and life-saving surgery. Like when we are talking about actual human being life and death incidents from a cyber attack, when we are talking about grid takedowns, then we are talking about effects in the physical world that are different. And I think we need to draw distinctions between those kinds of things, and draw distinctions between which kinds of targets are being affected. I think there is a sense that in the military intelligence space, while we might not like it, that there's a spy versus spy game going on, and right. We do stuff too, right?
Yeah. Yep, that's right. Well, Mieke, thank you so much for taking time to sit down and chat with me. We covered a lot of ground this morning. We could probably keep going for a lot longer.
I know. I have my actual fireside here.
I know. And it's actually cold enough in D.C. to warrant a fire.
Exactly.
But thank you for taking the time to join me today, and I really enjoyed talking with you. And I'm sure that I'll look forward to that podcast when it comes out.
Well, likewise, thank you for having me. Always interesting to talk to you, Michael. I always learn so much from our conversations, and it's really great to have this conversation.
Excellent.